3 minutes after 10 is the time. A very good morning to you. It is an odd news agenda at the moment. There's a lot of stuff about to happen that hasn't actually happened. The most serious of which would be a potential cessation of hostilities in Gaza, although that would be temporary. The autumn budget statement, whatever you call it, statement, budget, statement, autumn, budget, statement, autumn, is due to unfold on Wednesday. But of course, there is a lot of speculation surrounding what is likely to be in it. And there are some legal cases being brought against rugby and massive tech companies. I'm interested in both of those. I like the look of that Ofsted story that you just heard referred to in the news. If you are a teacher or you know any, alert them. That will probably be turning our attention to the question of whether or not Ofsted is fit for purpose a little later in the programme. And the COVID inquiry continues with evidence, I think, this morning, or certainly today, from Sir Patrick Vallance, the former chief scientific advisor to the government, whose private diaries have already revealed that he held Boris Johnson in, if were such a thing possible, even lower regard than we do. And speaking of Boris Johnson, or indeed the Conservative Party, there's also a story I rather like about the, perhaps the return of the grown-ups, or at least the sensible people. If you are, as I was, surprised to learn that there are still some people in the Parliamentary Conservative Party who consider themselves sensible or One Nation Tories, they are, for the first time in what feels like an age, they are flexing their muscles a little and submitting polite policy requests to Rishi Sunak. It does sort of make you wonder how any party can have both, for example, David Cameron and Lee Anderson under the same umbrella. I think there's an existential threat to the Tory party that we would and should be talking about. I haven't quite found the right way into it yet. But I begin with a story that perhaps cuts to the heart of that question of what conservatism is and why it remains popular in a country where most people suffer as a consequence of big C conservative policies. It is, I think, Aneurin Bevan who said that the great challenge of the right-wing movement or the conservative movement in the 20th century was to persuade Labour, with a small L, to use their political power to keep wealth in power. So why would you want to keep wealth in power unless you were wealthy? I do not know. I usually quote Steinbeck at this point and his famous observation that there were no such things as poverty in Dust Bowl era America, just temporarily frustrated millionaires. And I think those two statements, those two quotes, cut to the very heart of inheritance tax and everything that I find confusing about it. I do find this eternally and enduringly fascinating. Inheritance tax affects about 4% of estates. The figure for 2020 to 2021, which I think is the most recently available, stands at about 3.73%. Let's presume it's gone up a little bit since then. You're looking roughly at fewer than 30,000 estates paying inheritance tax. Fewer than 30,000, 27,000 in that given period that are susceptible to inheritance tax. And yet opposition to it stands at about 37%. Today's first hour is going to be dedicated simply to the question of why. So if you've already got an answer to that, you don't need to wait for me to set my stall out. You can jump in immediately and share it on 0345 6060 973, because of all the things that seem to me to sustain inequality, to slow down social mobility, to perpetuate the culture of cap-doffing and deference in this country, the attitude to inheritance tax seems to me to be one of the most powerful. Here are people who have accrued more wealth than they could ever possibly need and more than anybody else in the country has. And when they pass, they will hand on huge sums of cash or significant sums of cash and assets to their heirs, to their descendants, or indeed to the charities and the institutions of their choice. At which point the government will step in and secure a significant chunk of it for the good of the nation, for the good of everybody. For the army, for the NHS, for teachers, for roads, for, well, pretty much everything that hasn't been privatised yet by the Tories. And the more money we can get for that stuff, and listen, of course, there are arguments about efficiency and scleroticism and whatever else you want to call it. But generally speaking, the more money we've got to spend on the country, i.e. everybody, stuff that we all either use or need or will do, then surely the better for everybody concerned. Except, I suppose, the people who can afford to pay their own way for everything from education to healthcare to, well, you can't really pay for your own roads yet in this country, can you? But you take my point. So I'm a naive old soul. I've got a terrible tendency to lurch towards undergraduate idealism on some subjects. And I would stress, lest you accuse me of hypocrisy, that every single time we approach a budget or an autumn statement, for the last 13 years, I find myself being softened up by Tory governments. I find the most fascinating question regarding wealth as how much is enough. And obviously for some people, it's never enough. Enough is never enough. You know, the obvious examples are kind of like Rupert Murdoch, I suppose. But it's never enough. Some people love the work that they do, and it just ends up delivering ever-increasing sums of money to them. I think perhaps Bill Gates would fit into that category, and possibly George Soros. But for other people, it's as if they can never have enough. And I understand that. I think now if the wheels fell off, I could probably get to the finishing line largely unscathed, but I couldn't yet reach the finishing line enjoying the same standard of living for myself and my loved ones that we currently enjoy. I need a few more years on the hamster wheel before I get to that point. But certainly, you know, childhood dreams of living in an enormous castle with a moat and stuff like that, they don't feel like things that I've given up on. They just feel like things that were a bit ridiculous at the time. So whenever a budget is approaching or an autumn statement, I find myself wondering why they're constantly trying to look after people who are already doing all right. And then I give my head a wobble and wind my neck in and slap myself around the face with a metaphorical wet fish and say, well, because they want my vote. So they're buying my vote by reflecting my financial security and promising to enhance it still further. And then I think, well, when I look at percentages, I'm very lucky. I'm very blessed. You know, I'm well into the 1%. And I'm not minted by any stretch of the imagination. That's the point. Earnings-wise, I'm well into the 1%. So if they're looking after me, how do people that they're not looking after end up thinking that they're looking after them as well? And I think inheritance tax is one of the best examples of that. I don't think when mum passes that we'll be eligible for inheritance tax. We're not in that, mum and dad, we're not in that category. But as things stand, I will be when I pass on to my children. They'll be eligible. And right there, in that moment, I can begin to understand the politics of it. Because, I don't want it for myself. I'm not going to be here. But this is a difficult world, and it's getting more difficult. And social mobility has slowed down, and there's been a sort of almost an ossification of financial strata. So just because I'm raising middle-class children with expensive educations doesn't actually mean that I'll be setting them up for life in the way that my dad was setting me up for life when he raised a middle-class child with an expensive education. That the world is changing a bit. So it seems more important now to hand on as much moolah as you can to your children. But how tiny is that category? How privileged am I to be even thinking in terms of leaving money to my children, and therefore feeling just that beginning, that flowering of resentment at the idea of you, the taxman, getting hold of it instead of it all going to them? But how ridiculous is that? In the context of representation, in a country where millions of people don't have £100 set aside for a rainy day right now. The boiler breaks, you don't know what you're going to do. You run out of money before you run out a month, and you're going to be eating pot noodles for tea. I mean, it is everywhere. Food banks. So inheritance tax will affect an almost negligible number of people. And yet it remains a very unpopular tax. And I just want to know why you think that is. I'm not, at the moment, in the mood for a big scrap on this. And I say that because whenever I do say it, I end up having a big scrap. But I've used myself very deliberately. I don't do that as much as I used to do, but I have used myself very deliberately here. It seems to me to be close to obnoxious that Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak are currently looking at ways to make me better off than I am today, right? And in the context of inheritance tax, to make my children better off in the event of my untimely death than they already would be. Because compared to the massive majority of children in this country, compared perhaps to your children, they've already done pretty well. Not as well, no, I mean, not as well as other people. I'm not Jeremy Hunt. I've got 7 flats in a luxury marina that I put up the rent on by 18% in the last few years while simultaneously complaining about inflation. I'm not a hedge fund man. I just do this. What I earn, I earn. I don't inherit anything. But I wouldn't mind leaving a bit. And I can feel that just kicking in then. Why should I have to pay a percentage, 40% of my estate to the taxman, when if I hadn't worked so hard to make so much money, then I wouldn't have to pay any. So I'm fascinated by that apparent dichotomy between the number of us that it actually affects and the unpopularity of it. I read this weekend that it affects about 4%, and about 37% of people are opposed to it. And I presume if you stick in the don't knows, then the people that are in favour of it are going to be around about the same figure. I'll check those numbers for you. But it is a tiny number of estates that are eligible for it. And therefore, I don't understand why the idea of increasing the number of estates eligible, not increasing the percentage that you'd pay, but by increasing the number of estates eligible is so unpopular, and why Jeremy Hunt sees it as a vote winner, reportedly, although that seems to be slightly on the slide as a consequence of polling in the red wall. If you hit the numbers now, you will get through, okay? And that's the question. Why is a tax that affects hardly anybody unpopular with, look, a tabloid headline alert. I'm going to use the word everybody when it doesn't actually apply at all, but it just sounds really pithy. Why is a tax that affects almost nobody popular with practically everybody? Unpopular with practically everybody. Hit the numbers now, you will get through. It's 10:16. It is 20 minutes after 10 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. And there it is. It's a huge misconception. It's a bit like ULEZ in Uxbridge. Loads of people voted Tory at the last by-election because they thought they were going to have to pay a charge, but they didn't have to pay a charge, and now no one's talking about ULEZ anymore. I wonder if inheritance tax is the same. If your estate is worth over £325,000, then you will have to pay inheritance tax, unless you leave everything above that threshold to your spouse or your civil partner, or a charity, or somewhat oddly, a community amateur sports club. That's also an exemption as well, which means I couldn't leave it to Kidderminster Harriers, unfortunately. And then, of course, when your partner or your spouse shuffles off this mortal coil, the 325 kicks in again. So for a couple, it's a de facto £650,000. So if mum and dad's house is worth £650,000 or less, you're never going to have to pay inheritance tax, which is almost all of us. And yet, there it is, a very unpopular tax, apparently, despite the fact that it affects hardly any of us. And I just want to know why you think that is. Not necessarily the justification of it, the morality, the rationale, although we'll probably get onto that, but why you think that dichotomy exists between not having to pay it and yet being very cross about it. Johnny's in on Teeb. Johnny, what would you like to say?
Morning, James.
Hello.
Don't savage me, please.
Well, it depends what you say.
I think it is because the middle classes pay it and the rich don't. The rich get away with it. And
this is your personal animus, I suspect, rather than you speaking.
Indeed,
yes.
Both my parents have died over the last 4 years.
I'm sorry.
I paid a chunk of inheritance tax, And I have various rich friends who basically said that's absolute madness that you've had to pay all that money.
No, I can't argue with you. I certainly can't savage you, because you describe a grave injustice, albeit that you describe it from a position of relative privilege. You look up the ladder and see people considerably better off than you, who via creative accounting and offshore assets and all the rest of it, they
and trust.
Yeah. They don't own newspapers, do they? These friends of yours, they don't own daily newspapers in this country by any chance, because they were, or indeed.
No, I think they're sort of more hedge funds and just extremely bright accountants.
The royal family. I don't even know how bright you have to be. You just need to be able to afford to pay. And of course, the royal family fall into this category as well. But surely, Johnny, this is an argument for going after those people with a little bit more alacrity.
I totally agree. I totally agree. I mean, I've got friends who own large estates, and they get passed down the line without paying anything, and it is totally unjust. Totally unjust.
Well, they're in trust, so you couldn't. For example, quite a lot of people inheriting the estates you described wouldn't actually be allowed to sell them without either permission of trustees or a bizarre act of God.
Well, I think there's a line where it can be broken.
Yes.
But no, I think you're right. Yeah, they are in trust and they're passed on down, as you say, with the royal family and everyone else. I mean, all these big houses and so on, they just get passed down, and they never pay a bean.
No.
It's the middle classes that get hit. And that's why it's unpopular.
And that's a very big constituency of middle class, because the middle class does not constitute 4% of the population, which is the only constituency eligible for paying inheritance tax. The middle class is probably 30 or 40% of the population. But I take your point. I cannot dispute it at all. In your situation, having been unlucky enough to lose your parents in quick succession, but lucky enough to inherit an estate eligible for inheritance tax, you look at people who've inherited considerably more than you and balk at the way that they've managed to avoid their responsibilities to society.
Yeah, it's kind of. I mean, I don't really balk at it, but it's a valid
complaint.
It's more the way they say that's crazy what you've had to spend. Because we won't have to, or my children won't have to.
Yes, and that rankles when you bring children into it, that their children won't be susceptible to this charge and your children will be. That actually rankles. And I think you're in a small cohort, but a cohort with a genuine grievance. I really do. But as we both agree, this is an argument for going after aristocrats and hedge funders rather than complaining about being in the cohort of having to pay. You want to increase the size of the cohort. But that's very true. So you can talk about the 325 threshold or the 650 threshold. Oddly, there's people richer than Croesus who will not be eligible for it at all. 25 after 10. Paul is in Bingham. Paul, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Nice to talk to you.
We'll see.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a little 3-bedroom house up in Nottinghamshire.
Right.
And we paid 30,000 for it back in the 1980s.
Yes.
It's now valued at something like 275,000.
Right.
Now, I've obviously spent money on making improvements, but there's a huge amount of wealth there that I have now gained through no effort of my own. I've just gained it by owning the property.
Yes.
And basically, I think I should pay tax on that. Or when I die, certainly I should pay tax on it. What have I done to deserve that?
This is the maddest inheritance tax phone-in ever. The first bloke's paid it and is pretty comfortable about having to do so, but points out that his really, really, really rich mates don't have to pay it. And the second call doesn't have to pay it, but for perfectly rational and morally just reasons, thinks that he probably should.
Well, absolutely. I mean, what have I done? I mean, I've lived in the house as well, so
yes.
I reckon the extra wealth there is maybe 175,000. So it's not a vast amount of money.
Well, it's not bad, is it, for doing nothing?
When I die, what have I done to earn that?
Nothing.
I haven't.
You're getting rewarded for being lucky enough for being a homeowner.
Absolutely. So basically, I think as a matter of principle.
Well, I mean, where would you put the threshold then?
difficult one.
It is, isn't it? Because 325 to me in the southeast seems, that seems reasonable. But of course, you move out of the southeast, and 325 goes a lot further.
Yeah. But somebody who bought a house down in the southeast in the 1980s, they're now worth, I don't know, maybe they've added
They could have added a zero.
Yes, huge amount. What have they done to earn that themselves? They haven't.
No, they haven't. But they have made every calculation.
And lived in the house.
They've lived in the house, and it has increased in value, often at a greater rate than their salary would have provided.
And the people who are against inheritance tax keep using lines like, "Oh well, I've worked hard to earn all this money, and I've already paid tax on it." Well, that wealth in property you haven't paid tax on.
That's a very good point, actually. That is the argument you always hear. We've already paid tax on it once. The only bit you've paid tax on is the bit that you bought it with. You haven't paid any tax on the bit that it has increased by. So if you've got a house worth £700,000 for a couple, by the time the children are taxed, you're paying about 20 grand. It's not even that much for most of the people that would fall into that category. It only becomes, I suppose, punitive when you're looking at £2 or £3 million estates plus. And as the first caller reminded us, Simon reminded us, a lot of them are going to be deploying creative accountants to exempt them from a lot of the charges. It's a funny old world. Thank you, Paul. All Human Life is here today. I often say I have the best callers in the business, and I think this morning's been a beautiful illustration of it. It is a lot more complicated than it initially appears, but reasons to have grievances now include, well, I don't really mind paying it as a relatively well-off member of the middle class, or the child of relatively well-off middle-class parents, but my really posh mates, the sorts who have their own shoots, they don't seem to pay it at all, and that seems a bit rum. I'm fully on board with that. It does indeed seem a bit rum. And then the second bit of the conversation would be, well, to be honest, why should anybody whose property has increased exponentially in value while they've just sat there watching Coronation Street or EastEnders, why should they not pay more on that essential windfall? But it's an ordinary person windfall, which perhaps is why I don't go quite as far as Paul and think that the threshold should come down from 325, because you want such. I mean, inherited wealth is I suppose. I was about to say it's one of the great antidotes to social stagnation, but I wonder if it actually is. I wonder if, in fact, it's the opposite, and it's actually one of the great obstacles to social mobility. 10:33 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Where is it? Why are so few of us affected by it? In fact, even my calculations look wrong. You've got another £175,000 per person, meaning that for a married couple, the threshold for inheritance tax is £1 million. You've basically got £1 million tax-free. So if you're inheriting, if your estate is worth over £1 million, you become eligible for it. If, for example, it was worth £1.2 million, then you would be paying 40% on £200,000. So you'd inherit £1 million plus £120,000, which is all right, isn't it? Really? I mean, I guess. And then, as quite a few of you are pointing out, picking up on Simon's point from Antibes, the people who are highly eligible for it, if you like, are going to be paying the best lawyers and accountants they can afford to ensure that they pay the absolute minimum they can get away with. And that's the most strong argument against it. Is that I shouldn't have to pay it as a lucky middle class member, because the really, really rich people, they're laughing all the way to the bank. But I don't know that stands up to consistent scrutiny. Vivian is in Southampton. Vivian, what would you like to say?
Well, I wanted to answer your original question, which was why, against all reason,
yes, why
people still. And I was thinking, well, I've been frustrated by this for about 40 years. But I'll just, a case study, because I've seen it up close and personal, is my in-laws, whose family legend is really they'd come up from a gardener on a country estate to a firefighter who scraped together to buy his own house in one of the new areas out around Harrow, and 1930 semi, and someone else was working another sort of fairly working class profession, and they bought their houses. And, I think modern day equivalent are the people who were able to buy their council houses under Thatcher's right to buy. So they're very, very proud. They feel that's what they've achieved. You and I might say, I achieved the top-rated radio programme, or I achieved. Well,
I'm also proud of accruing some capital, because it's what distinguishes us from people who are completely reliant upon their lords and masters for survival, doesn't it?
Yes, but I think then, in comparison with where they came from, or maybe some of their friends and neighbours and relatives, they see themselves as wealthy.
Yes.
They have a modest semi. And, recently it's increased in money. But I'm thinking back to the 1992 election, and my son was about 5 or 6. He'd just gone to infant school anyway, and he was trying to persuade my mother-in-law to vote Labour.
Right.
And she was saying, he's a Labour councillor.
Very precocious.
Yes. He was saying, "Oh, Grandma, it's very important. You must, it's very important. You must vote Labour." And she said, "Oh, darling, I'm so sorry. I can't afford to, because they tax, they bring in tax, they bring in inheritance tax." None of this applied to her.
No. Does it apply now, do you think? Would their estate be worth more than $1 million?
I think it might do, yes. I mean, the thing is, my father-in-law died recently, and obviously it didn't apply because not recently, a few years ago. And she downsized to sort of more, one of these wardens.
But they feel, so it is, so if you, so they always say that the happiest person is the person who lives on the biggest house in their street. It doesn't matter what's on the next street. So if you feel
and this is
wealthy,
a fairly posh, she feels wealthy there because out of all the old people's flats, and also they did make a lot of money in the end because their house was in Harpenden. And when the City of London became...
I'm just going to slow you down if I may, Vivian, because there's an awful lot of detail here and an awful lot of people waiting to speak.
All right, I'll just say, no. So I've been looking at this. Sorry, this is just a case study.
Yes, I know.
Saw up close. But I talk to people and they say, "Oh, I don't want to pay tax. I've achieved this." Yes. And I think the most important thing, that why they buy into the tabloid headlines, why when the Lib Dems tried this mansion tax for properties over $1 million, it didn't work because people are convinced they've become very wealthy.
So they think they'll be eligible for
where
it.
they came from. They believe it. They don't believe what we tell them. They don't believe you.
Don't believe the numbers. They think they'll be eligible for it because of the journey that they have been on. And when they hear the numbers, somehow the numbers wash over their heads. There must be some truth in that. Because otherwise you wouldn't have the scenario that you have, which is the massive, massive, massive majority of the country are never going to be touched by inheritance tax. And yet, I mean, how much of it is Vivian's analysis of manipulation of the population, sort of creating in your mind the idea that you're part of the cohort that would be affected, even though you're just not, and you're highly unlikely to be. And that's not an opinion, that is counting. John's in Barnstable. John, what do you think?
Yeah, morning, James.
Hello, John.
Yes, very quick point. I'm to answer your question against IHT on principle.
No, that wasn't my question. Was why are so many people who aren't affected by it against it?
Well, because the very wealthy are able to avoid it, as has been discussed with.
Yes, but that's a reason. That's a reason to go after the very wealthy. It's not a reason to raise even less for the population in general.
James, my point is instead introduce a wealth tax collectible each year on assets. It's far better that the very wealthy pay tax on these assets during their lifetime. That's it in a nutshell.
Would that? I mean, surely you'd just deploy the same trust law and offshore tactics that you deploy now on inheritances, wouldn't you?
Well, that's for the clever politicians hard to sort.
Fair enough.
Make sure that isn't avoided. We need more tax revenues. The very wealthiest need to pay more tax. That's the way of working it out.
And in fact, then you remove that sort of unjust feeling of the tax feels like it's being levied on the heirs and the heiresses. It feels like it's being levied on the children, but when it's not. But it feels like it is. Whereas a wealth tax for living people, an annual wealth tax, which would be much smaller, of course, on savings or on property. I guess one problem with that, John, is that a lot of us would perhaps not be able to afford a tax on our property, even though we can afford to live in it. We're kind of living close to our our means as it is. But yes, it does have an air of justice to it that is perhaps lacking from the idea of hitting people's children over their head with these demands. Andy's in Chelmsford. Andy, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi, James. First time caller.
Welcome aboard.
Just a very quick one. I think this is to do basically, it's to do basically with what you means test and what you rings fence. I'll give you some very small details. I was unemployed for about 2 years, 20 years ago. I had a high income and a lot of savings. So I got no benefits at all. I was out of work for about 18 months. Yeah. I had no problem with that because effectively I had savings. And
so you were means tested for that?
I was means testing benefits, no problem at all with that.
Yeah.
I've got an old age pension just now. Because I had a high salary, I paid an awful lot of national insurance. I get the same old age pension as everybody else.
Yeah.
No problem with that at all, okay?
Yeah.
My problem is basically putting means testing onto things like old age pensions, where you can go, people have got a lot of savings, so they shouldn't get an old age pension. That's always been ring fenced and not means tested.
Yes.
And I think it's the same thing. People feel
it's a universal benefit.
Well, yeah, exactly. Now, what they're doing at the moment, they're means testing inheritance tax.
Yes.
Because obviously you've got to have very high levels of wealth, so it's means tested. So it's removing means testing. I think is what people really want. I think people object to it on the basis that effectively you've paid tax on this, and I think even people like me that aren't very wealthy.
You haven't paid tax on it because it's for almost everybody, it's going to be your property.
I agree, but it's the fact at the moment we means test it at the moment. If you remove it, you're removing the means test, and I think people just approve of means testing on certain things and not means testing on other things. I mean, if you're talking about just generating wealth for the economy, it'd be just as valid to say, right, okay, even though people pay national insurance, we should have basically means test pensions because people don't need the money. You can put it back into the state. That's my argument. I mean, people will agree or not agree with it.
I know. How much of it is what you think and how much of it is you speculating on what other people think?
Absolutely. To give you a quick example of this that you might not find humorous, my ex-wife I'll get on very well with. She's working and she's just got a old age pension. She's having to pay 40% tax on her pension and she really objects to that.
Because of her earning.
Exactly.
Because it's part of her income.
She's going, I paid the national insurance, why am I paying tax on it?
Yeah.
And my attitude is, well, tough. That's just part of the income tax system. So we argue about this on a friendly basis. So I can see the two different viewpoints.
Yes, I can as well. But I mean, then we're left with almost a philosophical question of where are we comfortable with means tests and where are we uncomfortable with them? But and then we're back to that age-old question of how much is enough. So you would say we'll put the threshold where it's enough. So no one needs to inherit more than £1 million. No one needs to inherit more than £500,000. No one needs to inherit more than £1.5 million. So above that figure, we will put a tax that is for the benefit of all of society. And it may even benefit your children's children who won't inherit anything because your children are going to, spaff it all up a wall. But to paraphrase Boris Johnson. But yeah, so why should I pay it when you shouldn't? That's means test looking down the ladder, and then not means testing. But why should I pay it when you don't? Looking up the ladder at people like Prince Charles. Do you know how much Prince Charles paid in inheritance tax from the late Queen? Yeah, nothing. This was a special dispensation agreed in 1993 by the then Prime Minister John Major, which meant that any inheritance passed from sovereign to sovereign avoids the 40% levy applied to assets valued at more than £325,000. But I would add into that £325,000 per person per property. So if you're inheriting it from two parents, it goes up to £650,000, and then you've got a £175,000 threshold on top of that. So it actually hits £1 million. So the Crown Estate has an estimated £15.2 billion in assets. 25% of the profits go to the royal family as the sovereign grant. The rest, I think, goes to the state, but they are held in perpetuity by the monarch in right of the crown. So assets can't be sold, and they are surrendered to the government in return for a grant. So that's kind of like what we were talking about. It might look unfair that people aren't paying inheritance tax, but the arrangements, I guess the royal family will be an exception to this, but it would therefore be, the government's guidance concluded, inappropriate for inheritance tax to be paid in respect of such assets. So because they can never sell them, it seems unfair to tax them. But then, of course, if you're the Earl of Kidderminster, as I one day hope to be, if you are the Earl of Kidderminster, then you simply put the palaces I'll have one outside. I'll probably have one in Chaddesley Corbett, and I'll have one in Haberley, and I might have one on the Offmore Farm Estate, and I'll be the Lord of Agborough as well. That would be part of my demesne. Is that the right word? Demesne? Demeanor? Anyway, you just simply put it all in trust in perpetuity. So it goes to your heirs. That's why, of course, I've never worked this out before. That's why some distant cousin gets it all, isn't it? If you pass away without any children, and then they find your distant cousin living in, living in a coal scuttle in Scunthorpe, and they suddenly becomes lord of the manor, because the alternative would be that it goes to the state, or it goes in tax, a huge chunk of it. But if it's a trust and you pass it on and you're never allowed to sell it, then you never pay tax on it. David's been in touch. He says, referring back, I think, to Vivian's call, he says, top marks for not sniggering at the words modest semi. I have no idea what you're talking about. It is 10 to 11. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. It affects hardly anybody, and yet almost everybody is opposed to it. It's a slight exaggeration for purposes of pithiness. But why is that? And a large part of the answer seems to be what you could call, what may historically become known as the Uxbridge-Ulez principle, which is if you tell people that they're going to be eligible for a charge, then why would you bother checking whether it's true or not when you can simply vote against it? Which is what happened in Uxbridge with regard to ULEZ. So you tell people, or even just create the impression in people's minds that they're going to be eligible for a charge, and of course they're going to vote against it. But then you've got a problem, isn't it? And that's a more societal problem of why people aren't a little bit prouder about paying tax, especially on money that has come as a form of windfall as opposed to a tax on earnings. Do you remember your first payslip? Do you remember it? Do you remember seeing it? And just balking at the figure of that just doesn't come to you. It's almost cruel to put the gross figure on a pay slip, isn't it? And then compare it to the net figure. And I know when you start work, your first few pay slips probably aren't going to hit you around the back of the head because you haven't reached the threshold. Or I was on emergency tax for my first few months at River Island because I don't know, I'd filled in the paperwork wrong or something. I think they were taking something like 50% of everything. I couldn't believe it. Now, obviously, I got a lovely rebate later. But goodness me, at the time it was quite unnerving. And then I got to work at Aquascutum on Regent Street. And I always remember this bloke. God, I haven't told you this story for years. In fact, most people won't have heard this story because my very limited supply of anecdotes normally gets recycled endlessly. But this one, for some reason, has been in the fridge for about a decade. So I used to think this was a significant contribution to conversations like this. So I started work as a student. And this was before tuition fees came in. This was when you just started having to take out a student loan to help with your maintenance, but you still got your tuition fees paid for. So it's a completely different universe from the one that's inherited by students and inhabited even by students today. And there was a fellow working there full time in the menswear department where I spent quite a few years actually in the end. And he was a very angry man. He's a very angry man. Looking back, I'm sure he had a lot to be angry about. But at the time, he just stood out for his anger levels. And quite a rude chap. He was quite rude to his colleagues as well, not just to the young whippersnappers like me who were doing it as a student job. And one time he came back from lunch, and I think he may have had a small sherbet. He came back from lunch even angrier than usual, and he got his payslip out, and he was pointing at how much tax he paid on the payslip and complaining that was spent on educating me. And I thought he had a point, actually. I'm not going to turn around to a well-oiled menswear consultant on Regent Street in the mid-1990s and start explaining why my philosophy degree was going to be to the benefit of the whole of society in a way that meant that he was actually getting quite good value for money on his income tax. Or, indeed, point out what a tiny proportion of his income tax was likely to be going on paying the tuition fees of undergraduates. But the idea that you're paying tax and a lot of it is being spent on stuff that won't benefit you, that works. That doesn't make you a wrong-un, does it? Or a vampire? But the simple sense of... And then you create the idea that it's all wasted anyway. It isn't. We took a call, didn't we, last week from a young lad who said, I think taxation is theft. And you just sort of think, all right, mate, what are you going to... So you don't... Hospitals, schools, roads, armies, whatever it is that the taxes have paid, you don't want any of that? It's just a silly position, but somewhere between those two posts probably lies a sensible path. 10:54 is the time. It won't affect you, but you hate it anyway. Why? June's in Heathrow. June, what would you like to say?
It seems to be that people seem to think that the inheritance tax is for people who've got money. My sister died at the age of 56. Her husband died when her son was 7.
Yeah.
She worked 3 jobs to keep the roof over her head and to keep everything going for them.
Yes.
Because of where she lives, the house cost more money, but she had to live there because she wanted to be surrounded by family to help her support her after her husband died.
Yes.
When she died, he had to pay £40,000 in inheritance tax. Now, all she had left was the money to bury her and her house.
And her what?
Now,
the money to bury her and what? Your phone went down.
Sorry, money to bury her and her house. That's the only 2 assets she had when she died.
Right.
Now, she worked three jobs to keep that roof over her son's head.
And there was no mortgage on it?
And no, there was no mortgage on it.
Okay.
Because they paid the mortgage off, but there was...
you put me in a very difficult
else.
situation, because she could easily have had a small mortgage on it and only worked 1 job.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I say she's got no mortgage on it. I know she had a loan on it.
Right, well that
which is a different thing to a mortgage, isn't it?
Yeah, but it would still come off the estate. So 40,000, so there was about 100 grand of asset over the 300 or over the £500,000. So she left about £600,000.
Yeah.
That's what
the house is worth.
And
it's
your nephew had to pay.
Semi-detached.
No, I know
house.
you told me that, but so £600,000 estate, and your nephew had to pay £40,000 inheritance tax.
Yeah.
So 560 grand clear.
And yeah, I know, but it's still.
No, I know, but it's still 560 grand, isn't it?
Life.
Yeah. How much did she pay for the house?
But she's worked all. I don't know how much she paid for it.
When did she buy it?
They come back from she bought it in 1982.
Right, so she probably paid about 1/10 of what its final value was, which is why she had no mortgage.
Yeah, but I still don't think it's right.
Why not?
But someone that's worked all their life.
Yeah, but she got paid for that. She got paid for working all her life.
And she paid tax for that as well.
Well, she didn't pay tax on the £500,000 that she made simply by owning a property for 40 years.
No, I'm sorry. I just think it's
You don't have to apologise. Just correct me if I've got anything wrong.
It should be means tested. If you've got these
it is means tested.
She lived another. So if she
it is means
in another
tested.
part of the country to keep away from the family who've got no support to look after because she's a widow.
Yeah.
She lived in another part of the country. He wouldn't have had to have paid that.
No. Because the house would have been worth less money. So we'd have inherited less.
Oh.
Yes.
Well, I just think it's wrong.
No, I know you do. You keep saying that, but I just think
it's wrong.
Yes, I know you do. But just to clarify, nothing I've said is wrong. Everything I've described to you is correct. Correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
But if you're working 3 jobs to keep a house going.
Yeah. But there's no mortgage on the house, so you didn't. Well, this is why I say you put me in a difficult position, because you're reaching for. Well, that would have come off the estate. So what was left is what gets taxed, and if it was in excess of £500,000, and there's a 40% charge on anything in excess of £500,000 after the loan has been paid. And I think I understand where your sense of injustice comes from. But the number of jobs she did isn't really relevant. She had assets worth £600,000. Which puts her in probably the top 10% of the population, however many jobs she worked.
For a 3-bedroom, falling apart house.
Well, it might have been falling apart, but that doesn't change its value, June. You must understand what the house is worth is what the tax is determined by, not how many jobs your sister had or whether or not the window frames needed painting.
It is, not what it's worth.
No, it's how much it's worth. No one says we're going to have a Surrey tax. Or we're going to have a Blackpool tax. It's how much the house is. If you live in a £2 million house in Blackpool, then you're going to pay £400,000 in inheritance tax.
Can you imagine a £2 million house in Blackpool, what you get?
Yes, I can, yes.
I'm sure it would be less than a 3-bedroom semi that's falling apart, would you?
Yes, it would, but the 3-bedroom semi is worth £600,000 in the area where your sister's house was. I don't know what I can do to help more, really, with this.
Well, I still think it's.
I know you do.
I just don't think it's right.
Yes, I know, but now we can agree that your reasons for thinking that don't really stand up, do they? It's just a feeling.
I still don't think it's
right.
right.
I know, but it's a feeling, isn't it?
It is. It's an emotion.
And there's nothing wrong with that, because your sister's tied up in it and your nephew's tied up in it. But the tax can't take into account your feelings. It can't be an emotional-driven tax. It just does. She should have been able to leave everything she had to her son. But then again, who shouldn't be allowed to leave everything they had to their son? Someone in a £1 million house, someone in a £5 million. They've got to draw the line somewhere, and they drew it in a place that meant that your nephew got £560,000 out of a £600,000 estate, which most people listening to would probably think was quite a good result, albeit that it was tragic that he lost his parents so young. It's coming up to 11 o'clock. Thank you, June. That was really helpful, actually, because I think there'll be a lot of people like you who just feel the injustice of it. But the numbers don't necessarily back that up. Up next, why is Ofsted in such a mess? It is 4 minutes after 11, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. We'll park the inheritance tax conversation for now, but when Wednesday comes around and the budget starts, do allow yourself a moment to wonder, particularly if you find my politics problematic, and yet are also perhaps aware of the fact that I'm generally in favour of policies that would affect me negatively. So do ask yourself why these politicians, these right-wing members of the media, or these members of the right-wing media, spend so long attacking the metropolitan elite. And yet whenever fiscal events come around, whenever budgets or autumn statements come around, they seem to be designed to delight the metropolitan elite. I just have a little wonder about that, because I don't know fully what the answer is, except perhaps that they don't have your best interests at heart. And speaking of which, there's another story around today, paid for by a secretly funded think tank and designed to whip up a bit of Islamophobia. So you'll forgive me for not going anywhere near that until the so-called think tank responsible for the so-called research tells me who pays their wages. They've all got fancy titles, though. God, I tell you, I'll be a senior fellow of this and a director general of that and a Lord High Panjundrum of the other. It's incredible the job titles you can get if you go to work for a secretly funded think tank that doesn't deserve or demand any qualifications whatsoever to get big jobs. It's great. 5 minutes after 11 is the time. So we'll turn our attention instead to a completely transparent survey. Commissioned, I think, by a trade union. It has been undertaken by a former schools minister and funded by the National Education Union. And it calls for a transformational alteration to school inspections. Now, when I turn my attention, well, rather more importantly, when I turn your attention to stories such as this one, I do feel the siren call of balance in the back of my mind. I start from a position of equanimity, of seeing two sides to the same argument. So on this one, for example, the question would be, is Ofsted fit for purpose? The inquiry has found that it is seen as toxic and suggested that schools should self-evaluate. So I suppose it's part of the culture of the BBC as well, in which we were all raised as consumers and viewers and listeners. So you'd have a debate, and it would be like, is Ofsted doing well? Here's someone from Ofsted to tell us that it's brilliant. And is Ofsted not doing well? Here's someone not from Ofsted to tell us that it's not doing well. But I have to say that in the context of the education watchdog, I sense that over the years we've spent together, and particularly after the suicide of the head teacher Ruth Perry earlier this year, I sense that the Ofsted conversation has moved on. And just to remind anybody who needs reminding, that the Samaritans and other organisations are always at great pains to stress that an event as profound as suicide should not be attributed to any single factor or event. It's a reductivist and often quite a dangerous thing to do. But we do know that this head teacher, that we do know that Ruth Perry had been profoundly upset by the impact of Ofsted inspections upon her school and therefore her life. And that is a large part of the reason why this inquiry has been commissioned. So I think unless you have a problem with this, in which case 03456060973, then I'm going to come at it from the presumption that Ofsted is at least a bit broken. We're looking at the Beyond Ofsted inquiry, which has called for a transformational alteration to school inspections, saying that the inspections really should just stop. Ofsted respond by saying inspections are needed to ensure a high-quality education. Do you know, I've just talked myself out of the thing that I was just trying to talk you into. I think probably we should ask whether these inspections are a good thing or a bad thing, rather than just work. So inspections per se, I see them as being a good thing, but Ofsted is clearly doing something wrong, or clearly being suboptimal, clearly not getting everything right. This is a confined conversation, I think. This is really one where teachers need to talk to me, and head teachers, and Ofsted inspectors, past or present. I don't know what the rules are governing what you can and can't talk to me about, but I do want to know why you think things have gone so badly wrong. So you'd have a self-evaluation instead of an Ofsted inspection. And that would involve an improvement partner from outside, like an ex-head teacher or an experienced school leader, even a current head from another trust or another local authority, to go in and have a look at a system which currently delivers single-word judgments. And I have to say, I've always found that a little bit unkind, a little bit unfair. If you get an outstanding, I guess you're probably not going to complain, are you? But anything below outstanding, right down to inadequate, it just doesn't really tell a very detailed story. I mean, we get appraisals here, as you could imagine. Mine is always outstanding, as you could imagine. But some of my colleagues who are deemed inadequate, they need a little bit more detail than that. They need to have it explained. You can't just say, listen to James Moore. You've got to give them detail and guidance, and you've got to show them where they can improve, and perhaps stop taking press releases from secretly funded think tanks and treating them like news. You know, you can't just put inadequate, can you? Or well, I don't know. So I guess we're asking whether or not Ofsted is fit for purpose, which is a balanced approach to it. What I've done is give you advance notice of what my view of this is likely to be. So there it is. Well, if I say what's gone wrong with Ofsted, then I'm already concluding that it's not fit for. Do you know what? It's my show. I can do things that appear to be slightly contradictory. So is Ofsted fit for purpose? 0345 6060 973. What's gone wrong with Ofsted? 0345 6060 973. And remember, this is a bit like the last hour. You might be sitting there thinking, well, I don't care, I haven't got kids. But these are the people, the children whose education is under discussion, are the children who are going to be looking after you if you get poorly, or, picking you up if you fall, or teaching your children when you do have them, or looking after your grandchildren. You see what I mean? It's silly not to see education as a subject of immense national and intrinsic national importance. So what's gone wrong? And what I don't have enough of a palette for this. I don't have enough background. But inspections, I kind of see why some people think they're necessary. But are we sure they are? You send in an outsider to inspect a school. I always think it's so much dependent upon the day that they arrive, isn't it? What if Johnny Miggins, who's a right little tearaway, has got mumps? So Johnny Miggins isn't at school, so you come in to do the Ofsted inspection, and the classroom is an absolute oasis of student commitment and scholarship. But if you'd come on a day when little Johnny Miggins was in school, it's like a war zone. But the Ofsted inspection has happened on a day when he wasn't at school, so you get an outstanding. If Johnny Miggins had been there, you'd get an inadequate. Do you see what I mean? That's the system. So it's not Ofsted per se that is fit or unfit for purpose. It's the current method of inspection. There you go. There is a point to these interminable monologues. I actually work out what I'm talking about in the course of talking to you. So does the mode of inspection, the current mode of inspection, work? Yes or no? 0345 6060 973. And then, do we need inspections at all? And if your answer to the first question is no, James, it doesn't work, then what has gone wrong? What has gone wrong? 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. It's 12 minutes after 11. So the inquiry says safeguarding should be looked at in separate yearly checks with a new national body. I completely agree with that. It's academics from University College London who've undertaken this, looking at a whole range of options for reform based on a survey, based on focus groups and international comparisons. That's something other people might know something about. And also a bit of sympathy for the inspector, a bit of sympathy for Ofsted from Lord Knight, who says it's become under-resourced when you consider the high-stakes job that it has to do. That would almost certainly track back to austerity, the godfather of which has just been brought back into the cabinet as Foreign Secretary, without ever being held to account or indeed properly scrutinised for the ludicrous raft of policies that suck the marrow out of many of our public services. So there's a lot to get your teeth into there. And anything I've forgotten to say, feel free to answer that as well. Should we take a call before the break? I like doing that. It kind of jazzes things up a bit. It's a bit like wearing a piano tie to work. It just makes me seem quite zany and out there. Yasmin's in Tower Hamlets. In fact, the first two calls are both from Tower Hamlets. We'll start with Yasmin. What would you like to say?
Hello.
Hello.
I'd like to say that schools and particularly the senior leadership team become obsessed with getting an outstanding grade.
Yes.
So you literally spend every walking, talking moment making sure that everyone's ready for the Ofsted inspection. Like you said, if there's a badly behaved class or student on that particular day,
yes,
then everyone spends the whole day in panic. I don't think any other profession is scrutinised in the way that teachers are. We get constant observations. We're always being checked on, and it's just become an obsession.
How long have you been doing the job?
17 years.
What was it like when you started?
It wasn't as bad as this because everyone wasn't obsessed with always getting an outstanding grade.
Well, you can see why they are. It affects funding because it affects pupil numbers and reputation.
Absolutely.
But how much less scrutiny was there 17 years ago?
It wasn't as obsessive as it is now.
When did it change? Do we know why?
Well, I think it mostly changed because of the government's obsession with us improving our league tables.
Right.
So it's all about the numbers. It's much less about the actual students.
I've never heard a teacher speaking warmly of it, actually. I don't think.
You won't do, because basically our lives have become a misery based on that word.
Based on the words Ofsted inspection. But what if you get an outstanding? Surely everybody's happy for a few weeks.
Oh, no, if you get an outstanding, then you're told you should be doing better next time.
You can't do better than outstanding.
Exactly. But, in the last school I worked in, we got an outstanding.
Yeah?
And we were told we mustn't sit on our laurels because next time we might not get an outstanding.
I see.
So you don't even get 5 minutes of pleasure from getting an outstanding.
Because you're automatically worried about losing it next time.
Absolutely. And to be honest with you, I
hope you're always honest with me, Yasmin.
I think parents put too much store by the words as well, because there's lots of ways of masking the inadequacies of a school. So parents shouldn't believe an outstanding Ofsted anyway.
OK. No, there's a lot there to unpick, and there'll be lots of other contributions as well. But the general sense of it not being very good for teachers doesn't necessarily, your final comments notwithstanding, doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad for parents or pupils. But I would have thought that a school full of happy teachers is likely to be a happy school, and a happy school is likely to be a good school. But then possibly I'm being a little naive again. Yasmin, thank you. It's 11:16. 19 minutes after 11 is the time. I may have to clear a line into the building for this, but I really want to speak to a teacher who likes Ofsted inspections. And I don't mean that in a glib way or a mischievous way. I don't know if I ever have. So just in terms of my own personal collection of ticked boxes as a radio presenter, can I please have a teacher who likes Ofsted inspections? A proper teacher, all right? Not an Ofsted inspector who used to be a teacher. A proper teacher currently working who likes Ofsted inspections, for whatever reason. 0345 6060 973. Chris is in Tower Hamlets, one of my regular educational correspondents, who I will introduce like a proper guest. Chris is a former headmaster who follows the education sector very closely and often treats us to the fruits of his knowledge. Chris, what would you like to say?
Morning, James. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
You mentioned the international comparison. I'm, as you know, a great believer in following the evidence.
Yes.
If something works, even if I don't like aspects of it, I'll support it. But it doesn't work. I mean, it plainly doesn't work. If it did, you wouldn't have a third of teachers leaving the profession, 5 years after they entered it, every single year.
It's incredible, isn't it?
The government missing its recruitment and retention targets for the last 10 years, every single year, if it works. But the international comparison is the really crucial one. Google this if you don't believe me.
Of course I believe you.
Finland is the key word. Everybody has always wanted to talk about Finland, including in particular Michael Gove. Look at Finland. Look at how well they're doing. Correctly, because they lead the educational league tables, for OECD. Finland, and they did lots of things about 30 years ago, crucial things, but one of the things they did was they abolished their inspection system completely and replaced it with a culture of responsibility and trust, which valued teacher and principal professionalism. And instead of punishing schools that were seen to be, in inverted commas, failing, they targeted, more and more resources and help and support to those teachers and those schools. It worked.
It did work. I don't need to Google it. I'm familiar with that. Also, they start much later, I think, in Finland as well. They really did tear it down and build it up again. So talk me through the culture change then. Why would Gove be citing Finland while simultaneously bringing in an awful lot of the things that contribute to some of the problems you've just described?
Yeah, the phrase cherry picking springs.
Okay, yes.
You look at the results. Don't look at the way you achieve those results and the resources that you have to put into it, to make it work.
So what's the culture then that you're describing that wasn't in place when you were in your pomp as a headmaster? Is it a presumption of guilt until innocence is proven? It's almost as if teachers are. Ofsted inspectors have far too much power, and teachers are to be suspicious of a teacher until they prove that you shouldn't be. Perhaps.
Yeah. Let me. This is not anecdotal. This is really critically important because I was there when Ofsted was first invented, so I saw the system growing.
Yes.
My first inspection in the school, same size school all the way through, there were 14 inspectors spent a week inside my school before they came to their judgment.
Wow.
By the time I left, an Ofsted inspection lasted for a day and a half. And the last inspection, I believe we had 4 inspectors. And they start feeding back to you on their judgment halfway through the second day.
But that's ridiculous.
Absolutely.
I'm just thinking about what I do. If someone came in on a random day and tried to judge the output of an entire year, it would be palpably absurd.
Exactly. I mean, that first inspection was actually really very supportive because, of course, they went everywhere. They were in dozens and dozens of lessons. They were in the playground. They were in the school canteen. They attended parents.
I never knew this. So what was it? Funding then? They just ripped the funding out of Ofsted, and therefore its ability to do the job that it was set up to do was completely compromised.
So you just focus basically on the exam results.
And then, So, and also you get stuff like this, which is anecdotal, but also I think pertinent. Yeah. This is from Angela. At my daughter's school, on inspection day, all the teachers stood outside cheerily welcoming the children, which never normally happens.
But, here's the really critical thing, James. At the end of my first inspection, the wonderful woman who led it, she also ran a company which trained Ofsted inspectors. Right. She said to me at the end of the inspection, Chris, would you mind if I used all the material that we've garnered on this school for training purposes? She said we'll anonymise it. We'll call it Ocean School, and you'll be Mr. Cod. Yeah. And she said the aim is that they go away for a weekend. She said I give them all the data, and I say to them, right, tell me about this school. And they said, you know what they're all going to say? I said, yes, they're all going to say it's a failing school. She said exactly. Okay. And over the weekend, she said I'll show them why. If they look closely and carefully at the school, they'll discover that it's actually just a very challenging school facing very, challenging problems.
Well, that's always been one of my amateurish objections to this whole scenario, this whole system, is that from your point of view, to simply get a child to attend who wasn't attending, never mind to get a D up to a C is a much greater achievement than retaining an A grade at A grade. And yet, under these systems of measurement and inspection, the first two examples are by the by, while the third is the Holy Grail.
Yeah. Yeah,
that just doesn't make sense, does it? Because it's the opposite of what education is supposed to mean. It's leading out from the Latin, isn't it? Not just maintaining high quality. If you're lucky enough to have high quality students to start with,
and if the quality is really that good, how do you explain these? Really jaw-dropping figures, suggesting that children's enjoyment of school is... Well, no, but that's the teachers, but the students.
The kids, yeah.
The numbers, an alarming 52% of 15 to 17-year-olds saying they dislike school. 52%.
That is alarming. I don't know what the numbers used to be, but well, there's some good news. Are you ready for this? You might want to sit down. Yeah. Rishi Sunak's given a speech. He's got 5 more pledges, although these are long-term promises. And I'll run through them all, Chris, because, it's that kind of programme. But it's the 5th one I want you to hold on to your hat for, all right?
Yes.
Reducing debt, cutting tax, securing energy, backing British business, and, wait for it, world-class education.
Excellent. 45% of classes in the country don't always have a maths teacher teaching their math lessons.
Yeah. But details. It's a pledge, mate. Well, just never mind the content. Feel the width. World-class education. Who's been in charge for the last 13 years? Why haven't we got a world-class education? At the moment, Rishi Sunak, I don't know. Never met the man. Highly unlikely that I ever will. But goodness me, the list of questions I'd have if I ever did is longer than your arm. Longer than the average Ofsted inspection. Actually, that's not even that long anymore. That was new, wasn't it? So you'd go in like a sort of crack SAS team back in the day, and therefore the inspection would be both thorough and helpful. Whereas if you cut it back to the bone, David Cameron, George Osborne, thank you once again, you've cut everything back to the bone, you're going through the motions, and all you can really look at is, oh look, there's some teachers outside greeting all the pupils cheerily. It's 11:28. Mike's in Maidstone. Mike, what would you like to say?
Hi James.
Hello,
first time caller, very long time listener.
Good man, welcome.
Thank you. Now I want to speak about a different perspective, still Ofsted, early years. So Ofsted regulates nurseries as well as childminders, as well as schools. So often forgotten. But I've worked in schools as well. I've seen the pressure. To use one of your phrases, footballification. There was an article only yesterday, I think it was, Guardian, talking about head teachers getting fired, bad Ofsted or even a good. The school's got outstanding.
But not outstanding, yeah.
Absolutely. So you've had this pressure, but in early years as well. So I used to run 4 nurseries.
Right.
And so our first nursery, we got outstanding within 6 months of opening. Of course, we were pleased. We were really happy, shouting from the rooftops. But if I look at it, I think, were we really outstanding? Although I was pleased with it, what is outstanding? Second one, we didn't do so well. Second Ofsted, requires improvement.
Right.
Now, when I look at it, that was 3 years down the line. We were far better run, far better organised, everything than the first one where we got outstanding. So it does make you think. But just to give you an example of their inconsistency, James, so I know a nursery who got marked down from outstanding to inadequate. And one of the things cited was that the Ofsted inspector wasn't happy because, so just to give you an idea, the children would help. They'll have a couple of helpers to go and collect lunch at lunchtime from the kitchen, a nice little task for them. They'd help each other pour drinks for their table. And so the Ofsted inspector wasn't happy because the children waited 5 minutes for their lunch and marked them down, and that was literally something.
It's binary then. It's got nothing to do. So it's almost a We're going to run out of time, Mike. I would have hurried you, but I didn't. It's dehumanising then, in a way.
Yeah, it really is. And just to say, another Ofsted inspection, another area. Praised that children were waiting 5 minutes for their lunch. So just totally inadequate. But the last thing I want to say is the pandemic. So nurseries were one of the only things open.
Yeah.
Yeah. So rightfully so, nurses were getting a lot of praise. But nurseries were open, and of course you can't social distance from a 2-year-old who needs their nose blown or whatever else, or sneezing all over you.
Of course you can't.
They were under a huge amount of pressure, and we were immensely proud of our team. But they did a brilliant job. Ofsted were off. They weren't inspecting. They weren't coming out.
So you didn't even get any credit for that?
They came back like a dog with after a bone, and they were marking down nurseries and schools like crazy. And
okay, no, that is interesting. Yeah, but I am going to have to go to the news, so I can work out the rest. I hadn't thought of that. Gosh, yeah, because again, it's being done in a sort of tick box binary way. Here's a funny thing. So I mentioned to you with my tongue in my cheek a moment ago that I've never met Rishi Sunak, and I certainly don't expect to be able to interview him or ask him any questions anytime soon. And that's fair enough. I'm not sort of moaning unduly about that, but because I think that this iteration of the Conservative Party is awful, and I've made that pretty clear, and therefore it would be a hostile environment, I suppose, for them to come into, and there are plenty of people prepared to provide them with a much warmer welcome. That's part of the problem with the whole country, really, is that even Boris Johnson could rely upon several members of this profession to tickle his tummy when he was presiding over the sort of moral collapse of our government, really. But you would expect Rishi Sunak, as a former City player, to have a little bit of respect for the Financial Times, would you, or not? Just and the political team at the Financial Times are exceptional journalists, including the deputy political editor Jim Pickard, who's just been at this speech in North London where Rishi Sunak has laid out 5 more pledges, and Sunak declined to take a question in a speech, a pre-autumn statement / budget speech. Declining to take questions from the Financial Times seems to me to be a little bit rum, to say the least. So Jim has helpfully provided the questions that he would have asked. And the first one is something that everybody should be asking Rishi Sunak. So if you do hear him or see him being interviewed anywhere, and the interviewer doesn't ask this question, that interviewer is letting you down, because this question is key. Why do you take credit for falling inflation this year when last year you claimed that rising inflation was outside government control? That's not, I don't think, a hardball question. That's just asking politicians to tell voters what they mean when they use certain words. And part of the problem that we've got in this country at the moment is a failure of journalists to pin them down on this kind of stuff. So if it was outside your control last year when the news was bad, how can it be this year a consequence of your actions when the news is good? And the second one is, should landlords be lifting rents by more than inflation? Which I think is a little nodge. I've just invented a new word. I like that. It's a combination of it's like a nod and a nudge. If a nod and a nudge had a baby together, it would be a nodge. And I think that the question there about landlords is a nodge towards the front page of the Daily Mirror today, when it has been reported that rent at a flat owned by Jeremy Hunt has increased by 18% at a time when he was urging pay restraint. And of course, it won't be a massive contributor towards inflation, but it would be a contributor nonetheless. So that's an 18% rise in rent at one of the 7 luxury apartments that the Chancellor and his wife own in Southampton, which is Rishi Sunak's constituency, isn't it? Oh, isn't that sweet? It's a small world. Back to Ofsted. I have not yet got a call. Can I just check? Have we got anyone waiting to talk to us? We haven't heard yet. And this is silly, and I'm not being mischievous, or it's not a gimme or a gotcha or anything else that begins with G. I want you to tell me, as a teacher, why you like Ofsted. Why you like Ofsted. That's all. A teacher who likes Ofsted, please. 03456060973 is the number that you need. A teacher, paging a teacher who likes Ofsted, please. That's all. I think it's an interesting question, possibly an important issue if we can't find one among all of the people listening to this programme, many of whom are teachers. Ruth's in Greenwich. Ruth, what would you like to say?
Morning, James.
Hello, Ruth.
My thunder was a little bit stolen by your head teacher.
Don't worry.
Previous. But because I was going to talk about, and if you don't mind, I'll still sort of recheck a couple of points,
yes,
and then give you some sort of anecdotal evidence just to show how, on a personal level, Ofsted has dramatically changed. My first, is that okay?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, right. My first Ofsted was 29 years ago last week. And I know that because it finished on my 40th birthday, and this Friday I was 69. So it's embedded in my mind. And just like your previous caller said, we were a school of some 650. Every department had their own inspector.
I didn't know this.
Yeah, they came, they introduced themselves, all 12 of them, 14 of them, in a staff briefing. And I was head of department at the time. I might have been head of year as well. And I was seen at least 3 times across the spectrum from sixth form to year 7. My department, when I had quite a lot of non-specialists, as you can imagine, drama. We were drama.
Oh, yeah.
And he would often come and feed back to me and sort of talk a little bit about, you might want to look at this, or, so-and-so's doing well there. But, so although it was, I'm not saying it wasn't a scary experience. I mean, we'd had a sort of huge sort of celebration at the end. There was not these one-word stuff. We got a proper report. It was like an old HMI.
Yeah. So
you were fine. So let's fast forward. And I think the next one we had, and it's when there's still no fear. I can think of a time when, again, my colleague and I, suddenly, the room that we were supposed to use, we were both teaching GCSE, and something happened, and we couldn't use we had a very small studio.
Right.
So we literally team talked in the hall, no fear, no, oh my God, it's not going to be the scheme of work. And the inspector came in, and it was peachy. They commended us for thinking on our feet. You'd never have done that. I then moved into sixth form, and the first inspection, again, it's scary, but it's not terrifying.
I understand.
And the guy with the lead inspector was the biggest guru in drama, A-level drama going. So he came to see me, I think, just because he wanted to.
Yeah.
And it was one of those lessons that just wasn't going to plan.
Right.
And I can remember going, oh, stop. No, this is no good. And completely went off track. But he was there to see the whole lesson. And his comment at the end was, would you like to come on tour with me and show them how to teach sixth form?
That's good.
So I'm a good teacher, James.
Yes.
I could get outstanding at the drop of a hat.
Right.
Let's fast forward to it's the penultimate. This is how many, they etched in your mind. Woman come, by then...
What year was this?
So the first one would have been 2005, and the next one would have been about 2012, 13.
So that was after they brought in the one-word framework.
Yeah. Well, or I think, you were starting to get all that. And we were then, I worked in a sixth form college, which has then been taken over for all sorts of reasons.
Yes.
And we were now 3 sites of over 2,500, 3,000 students. Each site was geographically about 5 miles apart. And we then have 4 or 5 inspectors. Somebody comes in to see me. She stays for 10 minutes. She did say to me, as she walked out, that was so very nearly outstanding.
Mm.
So I said, well, what was
Why
made
wasn't it? Yeah.
And she said, well, there was no group discussion. And I said, so I picked up my lesson plan and pointed and said, well, there will be.
Yes.
And she, but I won't see that.
We haven't got anything to discuss yet, mate, you said, I hope, or words to that effect.
We're doing all the practical.
Yeah.
And she said, yes, but I won't see that.
That's interesting.
And I said, well, could you stay and see it? And she said, no. So in the end, it almost because they had a tick box of what. So
it's not the fault of either the system or the inspector. It's just that the resourcing of Ofsted has lost track with the role of Ofsted.
It is, and also because, and then fast forward to the next one where I wasn't seen at all.
Stop fast forwarding.
Well, it is. Sorry.
Carry on.
Because I'm really old. And
yes.
I've had Ofsted.
No, you're not. Don't be daft.
Well, crikey. But the last one,
yes.
What you are then aware of, that they have now come in with a focus. And that focus was all about marking and feedback. And they were pretty much not interested in almost anything else.
Yeah, because they can't be. To be fair, no. I'm not defending them. Well, I am defending them actually because I understand the issue a bit better now, which is why we do it on the radio. So they have no choice because they're getting judged as well. They've got to do their job, so they've got to fill something in. They've got to come back with some form of inspection that's been completed. But because they're under-resourced and have little time, they end up narrowing the focus of their inspection until they're essentially delivering bobbins.
I mean, we had 4 inspectors or 5, across 3 sites of huge sixth forms, and they finished their inspection on Wednesday afternoon.
And how are you supposed to? And how many years does that inspection then cover? How many years does the judgment sit for?
Yes, it was about 5. And
that's madness, isn't it? That's nobody's fault except the people who've ripped the funding out of the inspectorate.
We didn't even try to get an outstanding. We knew we couldn't because of the results, because we're Lewisham and New Cross and wherever. So it's quite a difficult area, and our results were pretty good, but we could not reach. So it was like, if we can get a good, that's brilliant.
Thank you, Ruth. I mean, I'm still not here. I feel I need a little banjo and a song lyric. I've never met a teacher that likes Ofsted. It's like a rubbish George Formby song. Stephen has even posted a picture of some tumbleweed spooling across the screen. Have we got one yet? Have we got a teacher that? But that's got to matter, hasn't it? I shall tell Lord Knight this when we speak to him shortly. It's 11:45. It's 11:49 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. A bit of a break with tradition when it comes to guests and experts on the programme, but this Ofsted conversation has been so interesting that I thought I owed it to you, actually, to speak to Lord, previously Jim Knight, who's chaired this inquiry and come up with these conclusions. Jim, thank you for your time this morning. I've spent the best part of half an hour trying to find a teacher who likes Ofsted, and I've failed. Does that surprise you, and is it significant?
Look, it doesn't surprise me, and in some ways you could say it was always going to be the case. No one loves an inspector. Maybe no one loves a referee, but the very strong evidence that we've received in our inquiry, and I've seen repeated elsewhere, is that the inspection system has lost the trust of the profession. It's also increasingly losing the trust of parents. They've seen tragedies, they've seen people leaving the profession in their droves, and they're worried about the impact that has on their children.
Well, what are the key areas that you've identified then? I tell you that we've spoken to head teachers past and present, and one thing that I wasn't aware of was that at its inception, Ofsted was a completely different proposition. An Ofsted inspection would involve a significant number. One school in Tower Hamlets, 16 inspectors would go in and stay there for a while, and they would really be forensically examining the quality of education on offer. Now you might get one turning up for a day and a half and delivering a one-word judgment under which the school then has to live for for 3 or 4 years more. So what are the key areas of decline that you've identified?
Exactly as you've described it, James. 20 years ago, you did have a proper expert report with people having the time and the resource to properly understand the school. And we could go back to that, but it cost a fortune. And frankly, I don't know of a political party that's going to want to sign off that money. And when I've looked around the world at what other people do, you can do it differently, and everybody else does it differently. Nobody else does a single snapshot, 1.5 day judgment that then can end the career of a head teacher. So what other people do is that they mix more transparency over the outcome data to increase the accountability to parents locally, but alongside that, having an expert school improvement partner, if you like, who comes in, probably a serving head teacher, it might be more than one of them, who then works with the school leadership around where they might be able to improve. That's great professional development for those head teachers coming in as well, incidentally. So you start to create a self-improving system, and then the process is one about how can we help people improve rather than how can we take a snapshot and then judge them and write them off, which is why we have a culture of fear at the moment.
Well, you'd welcome that as a head teacher, wouldn't you? So if I'm understanding this correctly, what you've established and what has happened over 20 years is it's not necessarily a deliberate policy reversal or a deliberate introduction of the system that we've ended up with. It's almost like a process of attrition, a chipping away at what was there until what is left is just not fit for purpose.
Yes, and the other thing, to be fair, that I would say is that politicians like me, I was a schools minister a while ago, is that we've linked Ofsted outcomes to accountability, and that then ramps up the pressure even further. At the moment, if you get the wrong Ofsted judgment, then your school can be forced to become an academy, or it can be moved from one academy trust to another. Those are really big outcomes that massively affect a school, and means that for a head teacher, the pressure is really on, and that then goes all the way through the school and even impacts pupils who we've heard from who've said, they feel the pressure. They know that everything changes when Ofsted is coming.
Is there a country that best exemplifies the sort of system that you favour, that you prefer? Is there anywhere you looked at that you felt was getting almost all of it right?
Well, actually, I didn't have to go that far to like what I saw in Wales, to like what I've seen in the Republic of Ireland. But I really like what I see in international schools, where there are various quality assurance schemes in place, but where we see this form of peer accreditation really working. And the other thing I should say, James, is I do think there is an important role for Ofsted in making sure that these big school groups — I chair a large multi-academy trust, 28 schools, £150 million worth of turnover every year, and I do so with very little public accountability. That can change. Ofsted can come and hold me to account for how well I am making sure that school improvement process is working well.
Sort of overseeing the overseers, as it were.
Yeah, that's right. So, yes, of course, in any kind of work, you've got managers who are telling you what to do, and there's a little bit of tension around that at times. And we're saying at the top of the tree of management is the leadership and the governance of these big school groups, and they're the ones that we should really focus on in holding them to account. And
finally, Jim, the report, the Beyond Ofsted inquiry, commissioned by the National Education Union, what happens to it now? I mean, how optimistic are you that some of your suggestions will be taken up? And perhaps as a mark of how frustrating that process may prove to be, I can't currently remember who the Secretary of State for Education is, but I do recall that not that long ago, Andrea Jenkins was a minister. So I don't know how optimistic you are about a warm reception from the department.
Look, yes, the ministers change a lot.
Gillian Keegan, someone just said in my ear.
Yeah, congratulations to your ear. Yes, it is Gillian Keegan. And look, I think she knows that it's got to change. I think the incoming Chief Inspector, Martin Oliver, knows that it's got to change. And both, all of the political parties are frantically drawing up their manifestos for a general election in the next year or so. And I think they're listening. I think that they know that this regime has passed its sell-by date, and I hope that they're listening.
Well, we shall see. Many thanks indeed for your time today, and indeed for the conversation that your inquiry has inspired on the programme. That Beyond Ofsted inquiry, chaired by former Schools Minister Lord Jim Knight, funded by the National Education Union. And we've brought the interview in with just enough time to take one more call from Sally in Birmingham, who's been waiting for ages. Sally, what would you like to say?
Hello. It's been a very, very interesting conversation so far. I think we've had our own.
Don't spoil it, Sally. Don't spoil it now at the end.
Well, I was trying desperately to think of a way to say you finally found a teacher who appreciates and likes Ofsted, but I just can't. I'm afraid. I would say I do appreciate, and I think every school leader and teacher in the country would appreciate the need for some kind of accountability. Yes. There's no doubt there. But I agree with, I think, just about every single caller that you've had. Ofsted's not, and the report, Ofsted's not fit for purpose. Our own situation was that we were a good school. We became a requires improvement school because of one check on the single central register, which we put right at the time of inspection.
Yeah.
Our inspector really did not deal with our kids well. We're a very, very small, very alternate independent school. And despite us really trying to hammer home that our kids are a wonderful bunch of kids, yes, but really aren't very used to strangers, she bulldozed her way through them, I think is probably a good way to describe it.
Yes.
They complained about feeling threatened, about feeling set up, and that is not the culture that you want to instill anywhere in any school.
It also means they can't undertake a proper assessment in those circumstances. If the children have been alienated and upset, you're not going to get a picture of what the school is like on a day-to-day basis, are you?
Exactly.
So not to defend the inspector you encountered, but simply to fit your evidence into the bigger picture that we've assembled. I mean, she is going in with a very set modus operandi, which is determined in part by the lack of resources and the lack of So she's only got one song, really. She turns up and she sings it, and then she goes home again.
Exactly that. Making a square peg fit a round hole is never going to work, and that's why we have so many different types of schools, and that is great. But you then have to fit your inspection to manage that, I think. And the other thing is that I'm not sure many people have talked about is their complaints process, which has long been known to not be fit for purpose. There's just no point in complaining. We did complain, and it got us nowhere. We were not surprised by that. I think
so. There's no recourse.
There's no recourse at all. Their independent body that looks over their complaints is run by Ofsted anyway. It's all so insular. It's unbelievable.
And funnily enough, speaking of insular, one of the things that another teacher has asked me to point out to Jim Knight is that in the 80s they had a system when an inspector would be attached to the school, but one of the reasons given for stopping that system was that the inspectors were getting too close to the school, so no one thinks it's easy. Sally, perfect conclusion, and you kept the quality threshold as high as it had been throughout, so I'm very grateful to you for that. It is coming up to 12 noon. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Some interesting developments at the COVID inquiry. We'll be catching up with those in the next hour. Of course, a few people have pointed out, using the Finnish example, which was Chris in Tower Hamlets' model for improvement, not actually the Lord Knight, who's chaired this particular inquiry, but it doesn't mean he would disagree. Quite a few of you pointing out that ties in with the conversation we had in the first hour about taxation, because the system in Finland, I think, demands a different approach to taxation among the general population than we currently have in this country. But up next, suing big tech and why. 3 minutes after 12 is the time. Story that I've rejected. Young Britons turning to AI chatbots for help with school and work, because I think there's a bit of a moral panic underway here. I've spoken to my own about it, and AI chatbots are making their way into the classroom and into the educational process in a way that is going to be very unfamiliar to older people, but it isn't necessarily time yet for a moral panic about it. And also, we'll wait until we know a little bit more. Story that I've selected instead, and the reason I'm mentioning this is because they speak to a similar sort of segment of society or similar sort of issues, is a story about young people joining forces to take legal action against big tech, as we call it, Silicon Valley or big social media giants in particular. Now, it's an American story, this, but I'm pretty confident that it will be familiar to plenty of people in Britain. Hundreds of American families are suing Meta, TikTok, Google, and Snap Inc., which is the owner of Snapchat. Now, the American legal system is quite weird anyway. Well, that's not fair, is it? And also, I'm going to stop saying America. The United States, the legal system in the United States is... I just met a lovely woman in Birmingham when I was on my book tour, and she pointed out that America is a continent, not a country, and I'd never really properly registered that before. So can we put this on the list of things that you remind me about? Because I think she was Nicaraguan, and there's a lot of benighted territories in that part of the world, and I've never really registered that it means a lot to people. So if you could, just give me a little nudge every time I say America when I should say the United States or the USA. USA is probably easier because it's a form of cultural colonialism, isn't it, almost, or imperialism, cultural imperialism, and it's not right. So 4 USA companies, 4 companies in the USA, and the reason why I mention the legal system is because class act, well, it's 2 continents actually, I suppose, technically, but anyway, you take my point. The class action system means that when you can assemble hundreds and hundreds of plaintiffs against big, very, very wealthy. Erin Brockovich is where I'm getting this from. All right, I haven't studied American law. I'm getting it all from Erin Brockovich. So if that film is incorrect, I apologise for this thumbnail sketch of how the American legal system works. If Erin Brockovich took liberties with the facts, with the actuality, but we don't have class actions in this country in the same way, which is why these issues, these cases perhaps don't come up as much. And and indeed, the legal case hinges upon the platforms being harmful by design. And indeed, a British schoolgirl, Molly Russell, is likely to be cited as an important example of the potential harms faced by teenagers. Poor Molly. I find that story almost unbearable, by the way. But the bombardment of material about self-harm and suicide and depression that Molly was subjected to as a consequence of how the algorithms work was a massive wake-up call for many families, but I suppose perhaps not for the platforms, not for the tech companies that facilitate that sort of process. And the case is going to be really interesting. The judge has already ruled that a lack of robust age verification and poor parental controls are not issues of freedom of expression, which is what the big tech companies would have claimed. The family's saying, no, it's not a freedom of expression issue. And it speaks, doesn't it, that question, to something that we talk about quite a lot when it comes to freedom of choice. It's not a free choice to drink fizzy pop when billions of dollars are being spent on encouraging you to drink fizzy pop and no dollars are being spent on encouraging you not to. And quite a lot of these bogus libertarians talk about freedom when in fact they mean a removal of any obstacles to letting epic wealth control discourse and behaviour. So it's not a freedom of expression issue if you are deliberately engineering what young people see. You're taking away their freedom in many ways. It's an almost totalitarian relationship. And that's the backdrop of the conversation that we're going to have now. One of the young people who is part of the case is quoted as saying, and this is what we're going to talk about, addiction in this context. If I had my phone taken away, it felt like having withdrawals. It was unbearable. Literally, when I say it was addictive, I don't mean it was habit forming. I mean my body and mind craved that. And again, as with Molly Russell, it is the self-harm pages that this young person, Taylor Little, is most haunted by. She added, it felt like a cult. You're constantly bombarded with photographs of a body that you can't have without dying. That refers to body image and eating disorders, and you can't escape that. So there's some of the backdrop to this conversation, but I want to come at this from the angle of addiction, because we did it with hard drugs not long ago. We actually talked about where the line is between use or even excess use and actual addiction. And it was an incredibly powerful conversation. Incredibly powerful. It was only last month. And I think it might be even harder, perhaps, to pinpoint when a young person's social media use becomes addictive. And listen, if you want to bring an adult experience into this conversation, that's fine too. But I guess you're going to struggle to make a legal case for an adult having been, what's the word I'm looking for? Damaged? Yes, damaged, abused even by big tech. You know, the notion of freedom of choice with your use of social media to an adult is going to be a much more straightforward proposition, I think, than it could be for a young person, particularly if they're accessing material that they're not supposed to. If the age well, that's the crucial point, isn't it? That's the age verification processes that simply don't work. They're not worth the screens that they're printed on, are they? So that's really what I want to talk about. And I suppose we'll be coming at this initially from two angles. Either you are, well, three actually, even perhaps you are in the grip of what you would genuinely describe as an addiction to. And it's a particular type of social media at the center of these cases. It is the sort of social media that draws you to graphic material with no warning, often at very, very young ages, 10, 11 years old. So you may be in the grip of that, although obviously I hope not. The second category of people who may be able to contribute to this will be parents who have watched children fall into the clutches of sites dedicated to really grim and graphic issues and material. And you have watched it happen with almost a sense of powerlessness. And that perhaps is where addiction kicks in. Or we will be talking to someone who's come out the other side. Because what I want to pin down is when and how it becomes an addiction. When and how does it become an addiction? Because we all use smartphones. don't we? We all use almost. Don't text me to tell me you don't have a smartphone. Seriously, it's just a waste of everybody's time. Send me a carrier pigeon instead. We almost all use social media. Don't text me to tell me that you don't use social media. I acknowledge your existence, but it is not a helpful contribution to the conversation that we're having, unless the reason why you don't use social media is because you're a recovering addict, in which case I very much want to hear from you, ideally on the phones. Michael has texted already to say, as someone who has been in rehab for drug addiction, I can tell you that a number of key workers told me that in the next few years, smartphone rehab will be a thing. And that is probably a more broader notion of addiction than the one we're looking at here, which is the grim and graphic sights and images, scenes and sights that are being knowingly put into children's hands, highly addictive and damaging products, which is why hundreds of other American families in the US, are suing 4 of the biggest tech companies in the world. So how are we going to pin that down? And I don't really do performative ignorance. I think I perhaps used to. I used to exaggerate how little I knew about an issue, not out of deception or dishonesty, but just because I thought it was a better catalyst for getting you to call in and inform me. So I know my way around social media. I'm not big. Well, I am quite big on TikTok, but I'm not a big user. I know I'm big on TikTok because my kids told me, but I'm not a big user of TikTok. But I know how it all works, and I'm not going to pretend that I don't. But what I don't know is where you would draw the line between use and addiction, between safe and dangerous. And that's what I want you to tell me. I'm also interested in whether or not you think there could be a case legally for treating some of these tech companies in the same way that you'd treat a pharmaceutical company that was allowing children to get their hands on opioids. 0345 6060 973. Actually, that second bit there really focuses the mind, doesn't it? Because if you found that established companies, rather than illegal dealers, if you found that established companies were exploiting loopholes and failing to properly supervise a system that, as a consequence of which, meant that children were getting their hands on opioids and getting addicted to them, there wouldn't be much dispute or debate about legal responsibility, would there? Or indeed the success of a case. So that, I suspect, is key to this, is pinning down whether or not you can describe it as an addiction to something that they shouldn't have been able to access in the first place. That works, doesn't it, intellectually? So you get addicted to something that they shouldn't have been allowed to access in the first place. The question is, how did they access it? The answer is, well, they were buying it off a dealer on a street corner. Well, that's not the responsibility of the pharmaceutical firm that made the opioids or the opioid substitute. No case to answer. Tragedy. But then you've got children who are accessing the allegedly addictive material via platforms that are controlled and could be much more robustly policed to ensure that young people don't get access to the grim and graphic material that can be both traumatizing and addictive. Question, in the event of them suffering major trauma or becoming addicted, how responsible are the suppliers? Answer, very. Because it's not like some street corner social media knockoff that they're getting addicted to. It's the big stuff. It's the mainstream stuff. It's the big four, they would argue. It's 12:15. Hit the numbers now. You will get through. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. In the very, very specific context of social media usage, how would you determine and describe addiction? Actual addiction. Because we normally associate it with chemicals, which you ingest. This is different, but the question remains the same. Hit the numbers now. You will get through. It is 19 minutes after 12, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I mean, we may broaden out the question of addiction beyond the sort of sites that poor Molly Russell was being bombarded with before she died, and the case study that I gave you on this, because because of the response that I'm getting already. Mike tells me I went to Afghan with the army on a couple of tours. For the first month or so, I'd feel my phone buzz in my pocket and reach for it, even though we had to hand it in before we were deployed. in the last 6 months, I've closed lots of my social media accounts as I was spending an unhealthy amount of time on them, and I'm in my 40s. That's just a loss of time, though. It's not necessarily doing you damage. That's the question I should have asked. So add damaging to addictive. When does it become dangerous or damaging? Because most of us are probably mild, or many of us are mildly addicted to it. But where does the damage kick in? And already a mention, as there should be, of the great hack on Netflix, which, if you had to boil down the most interesting element of it, it would probably be the fact that an awful lot of the executives at the kind of firms that we're talking about don't let their children anywhere near the product that they're helping to put into the marketplace. That's quite significant. Imagine if you found out that an LBC presenter didn't let their children listen to LBC because they were worried about what it might do to their young brains. All right, maybe a couple of presenters, but generally speaking, we're a fairly healthy diet of discourse and debate. Imagine, what would you do if you found out I didn't let my... So you're listening to this now in the car with your children, and someone lets you know, it's found out that he doesn't let his own children listen to it because he thinks it will warp their minds. You'd be pretty perturbed, right? Well, that is one of the central revelations of the great hack on Netflix. They're queuing up some of these Silicon Valley honchos to explain why they don't let their own children near the stuff that they help to put into your children's hands, bedrooms, lives. Rob's in Milton Keynes. Rob, what would you like to say?
Yeah, hi, James. I'm a product designer. I've worked for a long time at the heart of these kinds of products. And there's an interesting and little-known fact that most of the people who run the Big Four, as you put them, went through a class at Stanford, which is a behavioral science class, which basically teaches you how to build products and services that are addictive.
Yes.
And what we're doing with the way in which these things are built is creating serotonin response stimulators that act in exactly the same way as gambling does. So you get patterns built into these that are asymmetric responses to certain types of reward. In the case of Facebook, for example, it's bad news because bad news keeps people addicted better than good news.
Does it?
In the case, bad news.
But I get it. So you think of serotonin as being a nice thing, but your brain tells you it's a nice thing, even though it's being prompted by bad things, by nasty things.
Exactly. Because they both create fight or flight stimulus, which effectively makes you double down on a certain type of response. And it comes from the early stuff around Pavlov's dogs and all of that sort of stuff, where they found out how animals respond to certain denials of a treat or rewards, and how you control animals. And after all, we are animals. And once you kind of unpick that code a little bit and built it into a system, then it's very, very hard to escape the maze. And that's totally by design, because the longer you spend attached to something and the more you reach for it, the more money they make.
But then again, the general experience will not be problematic. So how much do you punish the undamaged user for the experiences of the damaged user? Do you know, when I first learnt about this, I'm not as surprised by that. I didn't know there was a single class at Stanford that they all sat, but it was when I was researching fixed odds betting terminals, actually, that I came across the psychology of state corporate harm maximization, where it's a carefully calibrated calculation, isn't it? Where you need to get people to keep, you need to give them just enough winnings to get them to keep putting more and more money in. If they want a bit less, they'd give up a bit earlier, and if they want a bit more, they'd give up a bit earlier. So you're trying to just get it absolutely perfectly measured. But is it? I mean, we make it sound like something apocalyptic and new, but really, this is what businesses always do. They try and get as much customer as they can.
Well, they do. You're right, but with something that's in your hand and permanently about your person,
that's
then
the new
the opportunity to do that is greatly enhanced, isn't it? And the people who win in that space are the ones you reach for first when you open your phone. I mean, you only have to kind of observe your own behaviour around your phone to see how well these things are designed, because your thumb goes to a spot on the screen by design. And the design is the winning app that takes your attention. And, we all know who those are. And the things that happen when you get into those spaces, whether it's,
but where is the line, though? When does it become a damaging thing?
Well, you talk about people not letting their kids near things.
Yeah.
My kids were schooled in not being on it, and I'm not on any of that stuff. And as a family, it's not something we do restricted, but I made sure that they understood what they were getting into. And certainly, our youngest one isn't on anything, and has never been by his own choice. And and to a degree, he suffered because he hasn't seen friends in the way that he might have done, but I would say he's kind of clean. It's a funny thing, but I think we all suffer. We suffer greatly, and because it's not something you can see. It's very, very insidious.
But you make your living out of it.
I make my living out of designing things.
So you're in the sector. You're in the sector, but you're not necessarily in the front line of this particular.
Well, I was in the first wave of it all. So we built Facebook's advertising platform, I know how this works. But
your lad's going to use it when he's older, obviously. So it's
he's 18 now. He's 18,
and he's
now,
still not in it.
He's still not on it. And
okay.
That's his choice. I think he's an outlier in that. But you only have to watch the people around you and the way we all reach for things. You go to
this is where I think about moral panics, because it's also brilliant. It's also, I can find somewhere to have lunch now. I can find a bed for the night. I can find 200 reviews of my new book, How They Broke Britain, published by Penguin, in the eighth best-selling book on Amazon. I can find lots and lots of good stuff. So it's not a reason to get rid of the portal just because I can also find bad stuff.
I'm not saying it is. I'm saying that the kind of key players in the attention economy have engineered it to such a fine point that if you use any of those things, then you are inevitably dragged into it because of the way they're engineered.
Yeah.
TripAdvisor isn't the same. It's on the spectrum, but it's not an attention hogger, is it? It's a utility.
The problem is you've either lived it or you haven't you? Because I got mildly addicted to those collections of films of people accidentally hurting themselves, or ideally, the ones where children accidentally hurt adults. I find those hilarious, and now my Facebook feed is absolutely full of them. But this is not the stuff of either addiction or particular danger, is it? Unless I'm doing it at work and I lose 5 hours, unless I start doing it now and you libel someone and I'm not paying attention and the producer's gone to the loo and Ofcom are listening and we all get, but it's not going to have a deleterious effect on my life, really.
But not necessarily, but you think about the kind of the wormholes you've gone down with the 10-second videos on YouTube. You kind of come round and you go, oh my God, I've just spent 10 minutes doing that.
Yeah.
How did that happen? That's on purpose.
I know, I do. I guess
in there is deliberate.
Yeah, no, I know, I get that. I guess in my own experience, I've quite enjoyed that 10 minutes, and I don't feel that it's had any particularly damaging effect on my life. Which brings us back to the sort of sites. Would the serotonin thing or the dopamine thing apply there as well? Then, if you're looking at self-harm sites and anorexia.
Of course,
that's
because
awful.
Because the algorithm doesn't care what you look at as long as you spend enough time looking at it, and it's going to give you more of the thing that you've told it you want. It has no conscience at all as to what it shows you or doesn't. Which is why moderating these things is such a horrific Sisyphean task.
Yes.
And so damaging to the people who do it. And why...
I've read about that.
It's why...
And you're sitting in a cellar in San Francisco being paid a relative pittance, and you're being exposed for 8 hours straight to some of the grimmest...
Kenya.
Or outside, of course.
Bangalore, all of that horror's outsourced, isn't it?
Do you talk about it much in the profession? Do you talk about a reckoning that this can't go on like this at some point, somehow, somewhere? There's going to be a big clampdown on what goes on, or not?
These sorts of things, they kind of outright a conversation because so many people make their living out of them.
Well, the point,
and that's one of the difficult things about it is, we live in a world of dark patterns where everything is designed to game you.
Dark patterns. Yeah, that is it. Charlie Brooker again, way ahead of the time. Thank you, Rob. That's really helpful. I'm drawn to perhaps naive questions about the ease and the speed with which we've become a society where parents exercise very little or no control over what their children can look at. And if the parents can't do it, then whose job is it? Answer the people providing the images. But their age verification systems are meaningless. It's coming up to 12:30. You're listening to James O'Brien on at LBC. We'll catch up with events at the COVID inquiry after the headlines. And after that, I want more on this. I really want to nail down the point at which it becomes damaging, because me watching people accidentally kick their dad in the ghoulies, even if I suddenly notice that I've wasted an hour and 20 minutes watching video after video after video, it's not, do you see what I mean? It's not addictive and it's not damaging. So when does it become either or both of those things? 0345 60 973 is the number you need. 12:34 is the time. The questions surrounding the COVID inquiry remain a little nebulous. You know, I've shared this with you in the past. I'm keen to talk about it more. But some of the problems are almost intrinsic to the whole process. No one will be found guilty or innocent. It's an exercise in learning. It focuses on the government's response to the pandemic, but in contrast to what many of us would like to see, it will not cause, in any instance, punishment or consequences. And the more evidence emerges, the more some of us find ourselves thinking that we would quite like to see some punishments or consequences. But it's been the turn of Sir Patrick Vallance today, the former Chief Medical Officer, to give evidence. And Charlotte Lynch has been keeping a very close eye on proceedings.
And ultimately what he said so far, James, is that the UK was just too slow to act to control the virus. He's got 200 pages worth of a witness statement, which they are picking through now. They have been for the last 2 hours. And it has been shown in the last few minutes an entry from his diaries, which he said he was keeping at the end of almost every day as almost a brain dump for his own mental health, because there was just so much going on. And in it, he said that Boris Johnson, of course, at the time Prime Minister, was clearly bamboozled by the science. And it was a real struggle at the time for him and other scientists to get him to understand the data. It was also shown a diary entry from January 2020 where he quotes the former Prime Minister as having said, "My gut tells me that this will be fine." So ultimately, he is saying he was pushing for measures to be introduced sooner.
Gut, Boris Johnson's gut.
Exactly. He went from his gut, apparently, in January 2020. There was talk of some tension between then him and Chris Whitty as things started to escalate about whether they should have gone sooner in the lockdown. But he said the operational response, so actually implementing these measures, he said just weren't effective. Now, he's asked here about NPIs. If you've been keeping across it, you'll have heard this term NPI. Now, that is non-pharmaceutical interventions, the scientific term that they were using for lockdown.
There should have been an operational plan to have those ready to pull the trigger on as soon as they were needed. And what we see is it takes quite a long time to get those actually working and to get the process in place to do that. I think that is a sort of learnable lesson that you should start earlier. And I think I take the comment Andrew Parker, the previous head of MI5, has said very clearly that he heard the warnings that we were giving in early February and took actions in that organisation to do things. I'm not sure that urgency of action was as consistent and as reliable as it should have been across Whitehall at that time.
So he, of course, didn't expect his diary entries, he said, to be made public. In fact, he said he would write, what he had to say at that day as this mental health brain dump, he described it as, and then never intended on reading them again or even, thought that they would see the light of day. He also qualified, some of those. He said they were instant reflections and qualified some of those by saying that he would then sometimes have a completely contradictory view in the days that followed because so much was changing.
It's very human, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And, when so much is happening, he was trying to, keep control of it all, especially in such a serious situation. But he was, and he wrote in his diary that he was advocating for measures to be introduced sooner. And Chris Whitty, of course, the Chief Medical Officer, he at one point in this diary entry described as a delayer.
Right.
But upon reflection now, he said actually it was right and they worked together well because Whitty was thinking of, the health health picture as a whole, what impact it may have on the NHS, people who might be experiencing loneliness or other health issues, unable to get to other appointments. And he said that they levelled each other out. But ultimately, he said that measures should have been introduced sooner. He did say there was a week-long delay in March 2020. So they've been focusing on that weekend when the trigger was pulled, lockdown was introduced. It was first mulled over in February, he said. But there were objections from the Prime Minister and Rishi Sunak as Chancellor at the time. He said Patrick Vallance had suggested even locking London down because it was ahead of the rest of the country.
I remember that, actually.
But he said that objection actually came from Rishi Sunak as Chancellor because he was worried about the impact on the economy, which...
This is the heart of everything, isn't it, Charlotte? Is that the objections were built upon the idea of the damage it would do, where the scientists were explaining that the sooner you do it, the less damage there'll be.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the fundamental crux. The other thing we're learning, perhaps obliquely, is why they're so keen for the WhatsApps, why we still haven't seen Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak's WhatsApps, because if Patrick Vallance didn't think his diary was going to be seen by anybody ever, it's probably fair to say that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor were writing WhatsApps that they certainly weren't expecting to see the light of day at any point subsequently.
And we know that when people like Sir Patrick Vallance were telling them, making suggestions like, why don't we lock London down? We know that there was opposition from Rishi Sunak as Chancellor and Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, but what were they saying to each other behind the backs of those people?
Good grief, the mind boggled. Well, it doesn't boggle. It just, what it means is that what they actually were saying to each other must be worse than our most fevered imaginings.
We can only imagine so far, but yes. we may not have to. So there were those objections. He was asked directly by counsel to the inquiry, Andrew O'Connor-Casey, who's questioning him, about whether even that week earlier would have made a difference if we'd locked down in March 2020 a week earlier. But as you'll hear him say here, it wouldn't have made a difference because at that point we'd already lost control.
Even with that, because we got seeded so widely across the UK, not from China, not from the countries where people thought this would come from, but from Europe, with huge importations, and we can see this in the genomics.
This is half term?
This is half term. And we had a huge influx from Spain, France and Italy over that half term and beyond, which meant that we probably had lost control, and test, trace and isolate only works at low levels of prevalence and a high level of capacity in the system. With everything that we had in place or didn't have in place at the time, I'm afraid that the sort of ultimate option of trying to lock things down probably was the only route open at that time.
So he'd been pushing for earlier measures. As early as February. In fact, in January 2020, we saw him making these diary entries where the Prime Minister said, my gut tells me this will be fine. So even, a week earlier, if we'd locked down a week earlier, Sir Patrick Vallance saying there it wouldn't have made any difference, even if we had that effective test, trace and isolate system, which we heard at the time many people said we should have had sooner. But he said at that point we'd got so much of the virus in this country that had come in from Italy, from Spain, from half-term holidays, that we'd already, at that point lost control, and lockdown, therefore, was inevitable. These non-pharmaceutical interventions were then the only way to start flattening the curve.
We haven't seen anybody's reputation damaged while giving evidence yet, have we? If anything, the opposite has happened, because so many roads seem to lead to Boris Johnson in particular, and Rishi Sunak and Matt Hancock. So Vallance's testimony corroborating a lot of what Dominic Cummings said, for example. I think later today he's expected to reveal that Anders Tegnell, his opposite number in Stockholm, where Sweden often cited as an example of lighter touch, he reportedly told Patrick Vallance that they needed to do more to combat coronavirus for the reasons that you've just reported, the idea that we were letting it reach a point where the seeding... we were sitting here talking about airports, talking about half-term, talking about holidays, and just being completely baffled as to what was going on. But I guess the blood on the carpet comes when Johnson and Hancock and Sunak are in the room.
Exactly, and we're expecting that. We've not got an exact date confirmed for them, but in this module of the inquiry, so it's been split up into 4 parts. In this part of the inquiry, this is all the juicy stuff about political decision making, and it is, going to reach that point where we hear from Boris Johnson, and he will have to answer, to these claims that we are now hearing, as you say, Dominic Cummings backed up by Sir Patrick Vallance. We're going to hear from Chris Whitty as well, who are all, saying the exact same thing, which is Boris Johnson was bamboozled by the science. He was making decisions too late and just thought that it would be okay.
And bluster his way through it. Here is the massed ranks of the world's scientific expertise, and here is Boris Johnson's gut on the other side of the scales, and he's minded to go with the gut rather than the scientific expertise. Finally, Charlotte, he doesn't seem that discombobulated by the fact that his diary has become public. So, albeit that he's qualified a couple of things where, as we might all do if we kept a daily diary, you've changed it. I might say, that Charlotte Lynch has got right on my bananas today, and then tomorrow, she's the best colleague I've ever had. And you can say, but in terms of the substance, the central thrusts of it, he doesn't seem unduly unhappy about it all coming into the public domain.
And I think what you get from him as you're watching him, I mean, he's still, he's got complete conviction, and what he's saying, he still believes, he was advocating for the right thing, which was an earlier lockdown. Of course, there was this question asked about, was there tension between you and Chris Whitty? And I admit, when that question was asked, my ears pricked up. But he said, he thought that we should have delayed a bit. I thought we should have done it sooner, but actually that's why we worked well together, because he was thinking of the overarching health impact and I was thinking about the virus, COVID-19. So it balanced each other out well. So he doesn't seem embarrassed at all. He doesn't seem concerned about anything that he's written. Quite the opposite. In fact, he stands by everything he said.
Charlotte Lynch, many thanks. Continuing to watch the COVID inquiry, and even if something remarkable happens in the next 15 minutes, you will come steaming back into the studio. Otherwise, later today on LBC. It's coming. It's just gone 12:45. Back next to this question of when danger and addiction kicks in. A few of you worried about my developing habit of watching children kick their dads in the ghoulies. Look, I exaggerated slightly. I might once have noticed that I'd been watching it for an hour, but it doesn't mean I do it every day. I can go for weeks without watching any films of people slipping over on ice or out of control cars or whatever it may be. But what I'm pointing out, my social media has noticed that I like this stuff. So now, most mornings when I come into work, I'll allow myself 5 or 10 minutes of enjoying some footage of people tossing pancakes and then hitting themselves in the face with a frying pan by accident and that kind of thing. I don't know, it appeals to my sense of the slapstick. But this text here really stopped me in my tracks. James, it's simple. When it becomes addictive, it's simply when the algorithm finds someone with an addictive personality. Lock and load. So there it is. If I had an addictive personality, and there have been times in my life when I thought that I did, then I would now be watching several hours a day of this stuff. Or maybe it's the wrong stuff. I just haven't found the stuff that I could get addicted to yet. And if that ended up on my feed by accident, it would hook me in a way that people hitting themselves in the face with frying pans hasn't. And by the way, I like the ones that, you can see them laughing afterwards. I don't like the ones that leave you with a sense of dread that something terrible has happened. I don't watch those, so they don't come up on my thing. But what if you loved the ones that leave you with a sense of dread that something terrible has happened? What if that was where you got your serotonin kick? And speaking of serotonin kicks, my thanks to Corpsey, who spares me the indignity of having to pat myself on the back for having understood this a little bit better than I thought I did. He writes, bad news prompts serotonin and drives engagement more than good news, James. Who'd have thought it? If only there was a pithy phrase to describe this. Something like, it's easier to sell tickets to the ghost train than the Speak Your Weight machine. God, wise words indeed, Corpsey. I wonder who came up with those. 12:50 is the time. These notebooks are extraordinary. And I share what I can if you follow me on Twitter or Threads at Mr. James OB. But there's probably a German word for it, that sense of having your worst fears confirmed and it being a really horrible experience, because Johnson was worse than we feared. Here's an extract from Sir Patrick Vallance's notebooks that I don't think has been picked up yet at the inquiry. 5 hours of meetings with the PM. He came back from the Battle of Britain memorial service and was distressed by seeing everyone separated and in masks. Mad and spooky, we have got to end it, he said. Started challenging the numbers and questioning whether they really translate into deaths. He says it's not exponential, etc., etc. He looked broken, head in hands a lot. Is it because, this is in quotes from Boris Johnson, according to Patrick Vallance, is it because of the great libertarian nation we are that it spreads so much? More quotes, maybe we are licked as a species. More quotes, we are too bleep to get our act together. Back to Vallance, we went round in circles and then the famous whiteboard emerges. We discussed package A, which was mild in measures, and package C, which was a full lockdown, and when and how to do a circuit breaker. Eventually we agreed to a sort of circuit breaker and some stricter measures, but the PM kept clutching at straws. And then another bit that Adam Bienkov is sharing, if you follow him on Twitter, where the frustration at him simply not understanding things is quite extraordinary for someone that Nadine Dorries thinks is very clever. Claire Gardner talked PM through the graphs. It's difficult. He asks questions like, which line is the dark red one? Is he colourblind? And then, so you think positivity has gone up overnight? Then, oh God, bloody hell. But it is all the same stuff he was shown 6 hours ago. On the 22nd of July 2020, the Prime Minister struggled with the whole concept of doubling times. He just couldn't get it. And remember, miraculously, throughout this period, according to Jacob Rees-Mogg and Nadine Dorries, he was getting all the big calls right. What a relief. I'm almost mildly relieved that he was thinking with his gut at one of the points that Charlotte Lynch referred to a moment ago, because, of course, he spent most of his life thinking with a very different part of his body, which might have been even more problematic for the nation. Let's go back to Belfast. Christopher is there to steer us back to the conversation about addiction, really. Addiction and technology, social media and the whole shebang. Christopher, what would you like to say?
Yeah, hi James. I just wanted to say you were saying earlier on about how where and when does it become addiction, and I just think that that's probably slightly the wrong way around to approach the issue, because I think the issue is probably more like COVID in the sense that we don't know how addictive these technologies actually are, and we don't know how much of a detrimental impact they actually have on people, because we haven't got the definitive research to kind of say about those kind of things.
And
so
if,
really
if we've learned anything from the last 50 years, even if the tech companies had the definitive research, then just like the sort of pharmaceutical companies and the tobacco companies, the last thing they'd be doing is making it public.
Oh, no, exactly. And that's where I think that safety first approach is actually is the healthy approach.
But what would that look like?
Actually, I don't know.
I don't think it's feasible. You can't just stop it all, can you? I mean...
Oh, no, exactly, yep.
I don't know how hard it would be to have much, much, much more robust age verification things in place, but then children would find ways around them by tea time, wouldn't they?
No, exactly. But I just think that it's, I work as an historian and work in research in that sense. And the only, the only definitive thing you can say about, health and safety in the past 200 years is that private companies don't regulate themselves.
No, that's it, isn't it?
That's the only thing about it. And that's where I think the regulation is the kind of key thing about it, because just like you said, those companies have an incentive not to tell us how bad the technology is.
We've still got people like Rees-Mogg running around insisting that we need to deregulate, we need less regulation, when anybody with their head screwed on is going to look at the state of the world at the moment and think, you know what, we probably need a little bit more.
No, exactly. And that's where I think the regulation is. And as I said, working as an historian, that's the only definitive thing we can really say is that they don't regulate themselves.
No, and they never will. There needs to be a financial imperative or a criminal imperative. They need to be fearful of proper punishment in the event of not properly regulating themselves. Otherwise, they'll end up putting substandard cladding on the side of tower blocks. To pluck an example from our recent history. Thank you, Christopher. 12:55 is the time. It's a strange old business, this. Sustama is in Watford. Sustama, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I just wanted to join this conversation because I'm coming at it from a Buddhist perspective, and it's one where it's an understanding of how the mind works.
Yes.
And so I'll just keep it very simple. But so
are you calling me stupid?
I can.
Are you calling me stupid?
No, not at all.
No, probably just as well, actually, Sustana. Probably just as well.
Okay, so there's 3 levels of escape. And so the first one is when we experience suffering, so existential or psychological, not getting what we want or getting what we don't want, we automatically seek escape from that. And the easiest form of escape is sensory pleasure or pain. And before it used to be just drinking, smoking, sex. Now it includes social media.
Right.
And that's not a problem. That's normal.
Yes.
When it becomes a problem is when we start to identify with the habit of looking at certain material or doing the activities. So, for example, with smoker, we identify as being a smoker. And if if it starts to feed into our core belief, that's when it starts to become problematic, because then we're almost creating a prison for ourselves where we know what gives us pleasure and we know it will help us escape from our, say, difficulties or challenges that we face or just feelings. And then we start to look out for the thing to reinforce our particular identity that we now created.
Yes.
And so you take a young person who has low self-esteem issues and they find, in a way, they find relief when they meet other people who also feel the same as they do. But then the algorithm is set up to then feed them more, and they can get lost along the way. And then when that starts to happen, then it's very difficult to break out of that.
Because it's become who you think you are.
That's right. And all they want to do is reinforce that they're right about who they think they are.
That's absolutely heartbreaking.
And then the third level of escape is seeking oblivion, when all of a sudden we experience something that has nothing to do with our habit problem. It has something to do with, getting sick or someone dying, ourselves being, say, diagnosed with something terminal.
Yes.
And then the form of escape that used to give us escape from that suffering no longer is giving us that relief, but in fact creating more pain because it's not helping us anymore. Then we want to destroy who we think we are.
What's your background, Sistana? What's your field of expertise? How do you know all this stuff?
So I'm a Buddhist priest, and I specialize in Buddhist psychology.
That's absolutely fascinating. Thank you. I hope we can talk again. I just... Well, I don't know what the equivalent would be online, but if this was an algorithm, then you've just completely activated mine.
Well, great. Thanks.
No, thank you. I have to go. I have to crack on. The show has come to an end. Sheila is itching to get going. And I just want to read out something from Carl quickly in Liverpool. It goes, can you see your unconscious bias? Your popularity is supported by these viral videos and platforms. I'm a big fan of yours, but I just want to keep you honest. No, mate, Carl, if you get addicted to my viral content, then you just get more and more informed about things. So there's no escapism. You say, I'm not even being funny now. Sustana's talking about escapism. My viral content does the exact opposite. It gives people detailed information and evidence about what's actually going on around them. So it's the polar opposite of the problem that you described. But thanks for keeping an eye out for me. Nonetheless, it is just coming up to 1 o'clock. That's it from me for another day. Should we do it all again tomorrow morning from 10? I will if you do. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back to the whole show podcast on Global Player, pause, rewind, and all the rest of it. Download it free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Tom Swarbrick will be with you at 4. But now it's time for Sheila Fogarty. 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 Now it's time for Sheila Fogarty.